The heavy oak door of the Redemption Gulch Bank flew open, with a sound like a gunshot splintering the quiet midday hum. Jack Callahan, who had been on one knee explaining the silver eagle on a dollar coin to his 7-year-old daughter Annie, looked up. The world dissolved into chaos. 4 men, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, stormed the lobby. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice, their colts barking orders that were punctuated by the terrified gasps of the half-dozen patrons and 2 tellers. Annie screamed a thin, sharp sound that sliced through the sudden pandemonium. Jack reacted without thought, pulling her into his body and shielding her head as he scrambled behind a thick writing desk. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. The leader of the outlaws strode to the center of the room, his movements possessing a strange, theatrical grace. He was taller than the others, his duster hanging from broad shoulders, and his voice when he spoke was not a ragged shout, but a low, confident baritone that carried an unnerving calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, sweeping a gloved hand in a mocking bow, "your contributions to the Silas Kane Retirement Fund are now being accepted. Please be prompt. Delays will be penalized." His name, Silas Kane, hung in the air like a death sentence. Jack had heard the whispers a ghost who led a pack of wolves, a man who burned what he couldn't take and salted the earth where he stood. This was no common road agent. This was a plague. One of Kane's men vaulted over the teller's cage, his boots thudding on the polished wood. Another shoved the bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, toward the open vault. The third stood guard at the door, his shotgun a grim promise to the dusty street outside. But Kane himself did not move toward the money. Instead, his eyes, dark and sharp above the bandana, scanned the terrified faces huddled on the floor. They were the eyes of a hawk searching not for prey, but for something to break. They settled on Jack. Perhaps it was the protective way Jack held his daughter or the defiant set of his jaw. Kane walked toward the desk, his spurs ringing a cold, deliberate rhythm on the floorboards. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. He tightened his grip on Annie, who was trembling uncontrollably, her small face buried in his chest. Well now. A father's love. Kane mused, his voice dripping with contempt. He nudged Jack's shoulder with the toe of his boot. A noble thing. Get up. Slowly. Jack rose, keeping Annie behind him. He met Kane's gaze, refusing to show the terror that was churning in his gut. Kane's eyes narrowed, and then they dropped to Jack's throat. A glint of silver caught his attention. Hanging from a worn leather cord around Jack's neck was a small, intricately engraved locket. "What have we here?" Kane reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against the locket. It was a simple thing worth little in coin, but it was the last piece of Jack's world. It held a miniature portrait of his late wife, Mary, and a lock of her golden hair. It was all he had left of her. "A trinket," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "It's nothing." Nothing. Kane's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. He didn't try to unfasten the cord. Instead, he curled his fingers around it and yanked. The leather snapped. The locket fell into his palm. Jack flinched as if he'd been struck, a raw, involuntary gasp escaping his lips. The violation was more profound than any physical blow. Kane opened the locket, his eyes studying the tiny portrait inside. A strange stillness came over him. For a moment, the charismatic outlaw vanished, replaced by something colder, something ancient and full of hate. He snapped it shut. "You're right," he said, his voice suddenly stripped of its theatricality, leaving only a chilling venom. "It is nothing." He didn't pocket it. He didn't toss it into the sack with the money. In a final deliberate act of humiliation, he dropped the locket to the floor and brought the heel of his boot down upon it. the soft silver crumpled with a sickening crunch. The hinge shattered. The face of Mary, smiling and vibrant, was crushed into the dusty floorboards. A roar of pure, helpless rage built in Jack's throat, but it died before it could escape. Annie's small hand squeezed his silent plea. For her. He had to endure this for her. A lesson, friend, Kane whispered, leaning close. Everything you love can be broken. He turned and strode back to the center of the room, just as his men emerged from the vault, their bags heavy with cash and coin. Our business here is concluded, he announced. The men backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the frozen patrons. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone, leaving behind a shattered door, a violated safe, and a silence thick with terror and loss. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman began to sob. Mr. Henderson slumped against the wall, his face ashen. Jack sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the ruined pieces of silver on the floor. He gathered the mangled locket, the dust, the memory. He held the wreckage in his palm, the sharp, twisted metal digging into his skin. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. Silas Kane had not just robbed a bank. He had reached into Jack's past and desecrated his soul. And in that moment, in the dust and the silence, a cold, hard promise took root in Jack Callahan's heart. This was not over. The sun that baked the dust of Redemption Gulch into a brittle crust on the boardwalks seemed to mock the town's name. There was no redemption here, only a slow decay, a withering of spirit under a sky too vast and indifferent. In the days following the robbery, a palpable fear settled over the community like a shroud. It wasn't just the memory of the violence. It was the chilling realization that they were utterly unprotected, isolated figures in a landscape ruled by predators like Silas Kane. Jack Callahan felt the town's fear, but it was a distant hum beneath the roaring grief and rage in his own mind. He moved through his days in a fog of grim purpose. He mended the fences on his small ranch, his hands performing the familiar tasks, while his thoughts circled the image of a boot crushing the last likeness of his wife. He had tried to repair the locket, but it was hopeless. The silver was bent beyond recognition, the tiny portrait inside smeared into a meaningless blur. He kept the broken pieces in a small wooden box on Annie's bedside table, a constant, agonizing reminder of his failure to protect what mattered most. His grief for Mary, a dull ache he had learned to live with for 3 long years, was now sharp and fresh again. He saw her everywhere in the way the morning light caught the dust motes in the barn, in the scent of the wild roses that grew along the creek, in Annie's bright, curious eyes. He would find himself staring at the empty space on the porch swing where she used to sit, or he would flinch when a neighbor meaning well would say, "Mary would have been so proud of that girl." Each mention of her name was a fresh twist of the knife Kane had plunged into his heart. Redemption Gulch was a community living on the edge of ruin. Small ranches and homesteads were failing one by one, squeezed by a long drought and a string of misfortunes that felt too consistent to be accidental. A mysterious cattle sickness here, a suspicious barn fire there. And always after the disaster, an offer would come, a low but immediate cash buyout from a faceless land company based back east. Most broken and desperate took the offer. The whispers in the saloon and the general store all pointed to one man orchestrating the pressure. A powerful landowner who seemed to be systematically consolidating his control over the entire valley, especially the land that controlled the water. The name was never spoken aloud, but everyone knew. It was Kane. He wasn't just a bandit. He was an empire builder using terror as his primary tool of acquisition. A week after the robbery, Jack rode into town, the broken locket wrapped in a cloth in his pocket. He left Annie with a neighbor, a kind woman whose husband had been one of the first to sell his land and leave. The sheriff's office was a small, sun-bleached building squatting between the saloon and the undertaker. Inside, Sheriff Eli Vance sat behind a desk cluttered with yellowed papers, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, his only companion. Eli was a man worn down to the bone by a lifetime of thankless work. His face was a roadmap of disappointment, his eyes holding the weary cynicism of someone who had seen too many good men die and too many bad men prosper. He looked up as Jack entered, a flicker of pity in his gaze. "Jack, what can I do for you, though I expect I already know?" Jack unwrapped the cloth and placed the ruined locket on the desk. The mangled silver seemed to absorb all the light in the room. "Silas Kane, Jack," said his voice flat and hard. "I want him." Eli sighed, a long, rattling sound. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his gnarled fingers. "I'm sorry about this, son. Truly. It's a violation." He put it down gently. But wanting Kane and getting him are two different things, like wanting rain in a drought. You can pray all you like, but the sky's gonna do what it's gonna do. Are you even looking for him? Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Looking, Eli let out a short, bitter laugh. "I sent a wire to the marshals in Prescott. Sent another to the Rangers in Texas. You know what I got back? Sympathy. Kane and his men are ghosts. They ride out of the Badlands, hit hard, and vanish. They don't leave trails. They don't leave witnesses who live long enough to talk. That man owns the shadows in this valley, Jack." The sheriff leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, earnest plea. "I know what that locket meant to you. I knew Mary. She was a fine woman. But she's gone. You've still got Annie. You go chasing a phantom like Silas Kane, you'll be chasing him right into your own grave. And what happens to your little girl then? Some things, son, you just have to let go." The townspeople, whose hushed conversations Jack could hear through the open doorway, echoed the sheriff's sentiment. Their dialogue was a chorus of fear. "Did you hear Callahan's asking about Kane?" a man whispered at the saloon entrance. "Fool's errand. Best to keep your head down." Martha Kincaid, the storekeeper's wife, added her own sharp judgment. He ought to be thinking of his child, not his pride. The air was thick with their resignation, their acceptance of Kane's reign. But Jack couldn't accept it. It wasn't about pride, and it wasn't just about justice. It was about something deeper, something elemental. Kane had not just stolen from him. He had tried to erase a part of him. Jack looked at the sheriff, his eyes cold as chips of granite. He took Mary's locket. "It's not about the money, Eli. It's all I have left of her. Then what you have left is a memory." Eli countered, his voice tired but firm. "And a memory is a damn sight more than what you'll have if you go after him. You ain't coming back, Jack. That's not a warning. It's a prophecy." Jack picked up the broken pieces of silver, his fingers closing around them until the sharp edges bit into his palm. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the searing wound inside. He looked past the weary sheriff, past the fearful whispers of the town, and saw only one path forward. He would not let it go. He would not let Kane win. He would reclaim the last piece of his wife, or he would die trying. "Thanks for the advice, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice devoid of warmth. He turned and walked out of the office, the heavy thud of his boots on the boardwalk a declaration of intent. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a hunter. And he was going after the ghost that haunted Redemption Gulch. For 2 weeks, Jack Callahan was a ghost himself. He rode the sun-scorched plains and shadowed canyons, chasing rumors and whispers. He was a rancher, not a manhunter, and the criminal underworld was a foreign country with a language he didn't speak. He'd offer coin for information in dusty saloons and get only wary stares in return. He'd follow tracks that led to dead ends, his frustration mounting with every empty horizon. Kane's gang had melted back into the earth, leaving no trace. Sheriff Eli's words echoed in his mind. He owns the shadows in this valley. Jack was beginning to understand just how deep those shadows ran. His search eventually led him to the parched, forgotten end of the valley, a place where the failed homestead stood like skeletal warnings against hope. It was there, under a merciless afternoon sun, that he saw the column of black smoke. He spurred his horse, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He crested a small rise and saw it a small, struggling homestead, its modest cabin engulfed in flames. 3 men on horseback were watching the blaze with casual satisfaction. A 4th was roughly tying a woman's hands behind her back. She fought him, her movements fierce and desperate, but she was no match for his brute strength. Jack recognized the brand on the horses, a coiled snake, the unofficial mark of Kane's enforcers. These weren't just outlaws. They were the men who did the dirty work of his land-grabbing empire. Jack didn't hesitate. He drew his Winchester from its scabbard, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. He didn't shout a warning. He let the rifle do the talking. The first shot kicked up dust by the lead horse's hooves. The second splintered the porch railing a foot from one of the men's heads. It was enough. They were bullies, not soldiers. Unused to resistance, they scrambled for their horses, firing a few wild shots in Jack's direction before galloping away into the haze, leaving the woman kneeling in the dirt. Jack rode down, his rifle still ready. As he drew closer, he saw that the woman was trying to crawl toward the burning cabin, her face a mask of anguish. "My husband." She choked out tears, carving clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. He was inside. Jack's heart sank. He dismounted and cut her bonds, his knife slicing through the rough rope. "There's nothing you can do," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's too late." She collapsed, her body racked with sobs. Jack stood over her, a helpless witness to another life destroyed by Kane's greed. He knew her story without having to ask. They had refused to sell. This was the consequence. He stayed until the fire burned itself out, reducing the cabin to a smoking pile of charred timbers. When the woman finally found her voice again, it was brittle with grief and fury. Her name was Sarah Dawson. Her husband, Tom, had been a good man who believed in holding on to what was theirs. This small plot of land, she explained, was worthless for grazing, but it held the only year-round spring in the north end of the valley. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the key to controlling all the water rights. Kane had wanted it. Tom had said no. "He thought we could fight them," Sarah said, her voice hollow as she stared at the ruins. "He said this was our home. He didn't understand. They don't fight. They just burn." She looked up at Jack. Her eyes, though red-rimmed and full of pain, held a spark of unyielding steel. She was not broken, just bent. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Jack Callahan. I'm looking for Silas Kane." A flicker of something surprised suspicion crossed her face. "Why?" Jack didn't need to explain the details. The shared enemy was enough. "He took something from me." Sarah was silent for a long time. She was a woman who trusted no one, a lesson the world had taught her harshly. But this stranger had appeared from nowhere and driven off the men who had just destroyed her life. He was hunting the same monster she was. "You'll never find him the way you're looking," she said finally, her tone flat. "He doesn't use the main trails, the canyons and the high passes. They're a maze. But Tom, my husband, he grew up in these hills. He knew them. He showed me the old ways, the hidden paths the Apache used to use. A way into his territory where he'd never expect anyone to come from." Jack felt a surge of hope, the first in weeks. This was it. This was the key he'd been missing. Will you show me? Sarah looked from Jack's determined face to the smoldering grave of her husband and her home. Her grief was a cold, hard weight inside her, but beneath it, a different fire was beginning to burn, the fire of vengeance. Cain had taken everything from her: her husband, her home, her future. But he had left her with one thing: a reason to fight back. They think they've beaten me, she whispered, her hands clenching into fists in the dusty soil. They think because I'm a woman alone, I'll just disappear. She rose to her feet, wiping the tears from her face with a defiant gesture. I'm not going to disappear. She looked Jack square in the eye, a silent pact passing between them. A reluctant, dangerous alliance was forged in the ashes of her life. Get your gear, she said, her voice no longer trembling. I'll take you to him. But on one condition. Name it, Jack said. When you find him, she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. He's not the only one who has a debt to collect. The path Sarah Dawson knew was less a trail and more a memory etched into the unforgiving landscape. It wound through narrow, sunless canyons where the air was cool and still, and climbed scree-covered slopes that tested the endurance of both horse and rider. For days they traveled in a tense, watchful silence, two solitary figures moving through a world that seemed determined to reject them. Jack, accustomed to the open plains, found the labyrinthine terrain disorienting. He was completely dependent on Sarah's knowledge, and he watched with grudging admiration as she navigated the treacherous country, her focus absolute, her grief channeled into a sharp, clear purpose. Their first breakthrough came in a box canyon hidden behind a waterfall that dwindled to a mere trickle in the dry season. Tucked into a recess in the rock wall was an old line shack, barely more than a hovel, but it had been used recently. Inside, on a crude table, they found a leather-bound ledger. This is it. Sarah breathed, her fingers tracing the neat columns of script. It wasn't a record of stolen goods, but of land acquisitions. Dozens of entries detailed the purchase of ranches and homesteads throughout the valley, all bought for a fraction of their worth by the S. King Land and Cattle Company. S. King, Jack muttered, running a hand over his jaw. Silas Kane. He's not even trying to hide it. Why should he? Sarah countered, her voice bitter. Who would dare challenge him? He's buying the valley with the money he steals from it and using fear to drive down the price. She flipped through the pages, her expression hardening. He took my husband's land, but he won't take my spirit. Tom would have wanted me to see this through. They rode on the ledger, tucked safely in Jack's saddlebag. The knowledge that Cain was not just a bandit, but a calculating tyrant, only solidified Jack's resolve. This was bigger than a stolen locket. This was a war for the soul of the valley. As they drew deeper into Cain's territory, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Cain seemed to be a step ahead of them. A waterhole they were counting on was fouled. A narrow pass was blocked by a sudden rock slide that felt too deliberate to be natural. It was as if Cain knew he was being followed, as if he knew Jack personally. The feeling crystallized into cold certainty when they came upon the ruins of another raided homestead. The scene was one of utter devastation. The family was gone, likely dead or driven off. But Cain had left a message. Placed carefully on the cold stone of the hearth like a calling card was a single perfectly pressed wildflower, a desert marigold. Jack froze. His blood ran cold. It wasn't just any flower. It was the same type that grew in abundance around the ruins of his own family's original homestead. Miles away, a place he hadn't been to in over a decade. The place where he had first met Mary. It was a symbol so specific, so deeply personal, that it could not be a coincidence. "What is it?" Sarah asked, seeing the color drain from his face. "He knows me," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. The hunt had changed. This wasn't a stranger he was tracking anymore. This was a ghost from his own past, a ghost who was now taunting him, playing a cruel game whose rules only he seemed to know. The question was no longer just where Silas Kane was, but who he was. The answer came 2 days later in an abandoned cantina in a ghost town that had long ago been swallowed by the desert. It had clearly served as a more permanent hideout for Kane's gang. Dust lay thick on everything, but there were signs of recent occupation: empty bottles, discarded ammunition, the lingering smell of stale cigar smoke. While Sarah searched the main room, Jack found himself drawn to a small back office. A heavy wooden chest sat in the corner, its lock broken. He lifted the lid. Inside, amongst moldering papers and maps, was a small tin box. He pried it open. It contained a handful of personal items, a pair of cufflinks, a tarnished silver dollar, and a faded photograph. He picked up the photograph. The world tilted on its axis. His breath hitched in his chest, and the air seemed to turn to ice in his lungs. It was a picture of 4 people, young and smiling, squinting against a bright sun. On the left stood a younger, happier Jack Callahan, his arm around his beautiful wife, Mary. On the right stood another couple. The woman was unfamiliar at first, but then he saw the resemblance. She had Mary's eyes, Mary's smile. It was her younger sister Elizabeth, who had died years ago. And the man standing next to her, his arm possessively around her waist, a confident, almost arrogant grin on his face, was a younger, clean-shaven Silas Kane. The truth crashed down on Jack with the force of a physical blow. Silas Kane was his brother-in-law. The memories, long buried under the weight of grief, came flooding back. The shared venture, the silver mine they had bought together, full of promises of wealth and a shared future. The ambition, the risks, the warnings ignored. And then, the tragedy. The sudden, catastrophic collapse of the main tunnel during a spring thaw. A disaster that had claimed the lives of both Mary and Elizabeth, who had come to the mine that day to bring them lunch. Jack had survived, pulled from the rubble, broken and half dead. Silas had been away in town, securing equipment. By the time he returned, it was over. Jack had always assumed Silas's subsequent disappearance was born of a grief too profound to bear. He had vanished, and Jack, lost in his own sorrow, had never searched for him. Now he understood. It wasn't grief that had driven Silas away. It was blame. It was hatred. This entire bloody campaign, the robberies, the land grabs, the terror, it wasn't about money or power. It was a deeply personal, meticulously planned vendetta. Silas Kane blamed Jack for the death of his wife, for the destruction of his world. He was systematically destroying Jack's world in return peace by agonizing peace. The stolen locket wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was the first move in a final terrible chess game. And Jack had just been played into checkmate. He sank onto a dusty crate, the photograph trembling in his hand. The fight for a piece of silver had become a battle for his own soul against a man bound to him by love and loss, now twisted into a monster by a shared, unforgivable past. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a silent, grim journey. The photograph felt like a lead weight in Jack's pocket, every crinkle of the paper a fresh reminder of the devastating truth. His quest for justice had become a reckoning with his own history, and the man he hunted was no longer a faceless villain, but a specter of his own making. Sarah rode beside him, sensing the profound shift in his demeanor. She didn't press for details, her own grief having taught her the sanctity of a man's silence when he's staring into an abyss. They arrived in town under the cloak of twilight. A cold dread, separate from the exhaustion of their journey, began to creep into Jack's bones. He had left Annie in the care of Mrs. Gable, a kindly widow who lived at the edge of town. As he dismounted in front of her small, neat house, the first thing he noticed was the unnatural quiet. The front door was slightly ajar. "Annie," he called out, his voice tight. He pushed the door open. The house was in disarray. A chair was overturned. A vase of wildflowers lay shattered on the floor, the water forming a dark pool on the wooden planks. Mrs. Gable was slumped in a rocking chair, a dark bruise on her temple, dazed but alive. "Jack," she mumbled, her eyes struggling to focus. "A man. He said he was an old friend of yours." Annie knew him. She said his name was Uncle Silas. Jack's blood froze. He ran through the small house, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. The back room where Annie had been sleeping was empty. Her small blanket was crumpled on the cot, and in the center of the pillow, placed with the same deliberate, taunting care as the flower on the hearth, was a single familiar object, a desert marigold. Tucked beneath it was a folded piece of paper. Jack's hands shook as he opened it. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and filled with a cold, controlled fury. "You found my picture. You finally remember. Now it's time you remembered the rest. Come to where it all ended, the Black Creek Mine. Come alone. Your daughter is waiting to see which of us is to blame for all this death." Cain had retaliated. Enraged by the discovery of his past, he had raised the stakes to their absolute peak. He had taken the one thing Jack had left in the world to live for. He had turned their shared history into a weapon and was now forcing Jack to return to the very ground where their families had been shattered. Jack had to confront the ghosts of his past to save his future. He stumbled out onto the porch, the note crushed in his fist. Sarah was there, her face pale in the fading light, having seen the disarray inside. "He has her," Jack choked out the words like shards of glass in his throat. There was no more room for strategy, no more need for stealth. This was no longer a hunt. It was a summons. Jack checked his Colt, his movements jerky and automatic. He slid his Winchester from its scabbard. "You can't go alone." Sarah said, her voice firm. "That's what he wants." "She's my daughter," Jack said, his gaze fixed on the dark, brooding mountains to the north where the Black Creek Mine lay, like an open wound in the earth. "This is my fight. It always has been." "He took my husband," Sarah shot back, her own pain flaring. "He burned my home. This is my fight, too. You need me, Jack, whether you'll admit it or not." He looked at her, seeing the fierce resolve in her eyes. She was right. But he couldn't risk her. "Stay here. Get the sheriff. Tell him where I've gone. If I'm not back by dawn—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He swung himself into the saddle, his body moving with a desperate urgency. He spurred his horse, galloping out of the stunned, silent town and into the encroaching darkness. The storm that had been brewing in his soul for years was about to break, and it was pulling him toward the collapsing, haunted depths of the Black Creek Mine. The sky wept. A low, rumbling thunder echoed Jack's own tormented heart as he rode toward the Black Creek Mine. Rain began to fall first, as a whisper, then as a relentless, driving torrent that turned the rocky trail into a slick, treacherous morass. Lightning split the heavens, momentarily illuminating the skeletal remains of the mine's head frame, a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple clouds. The place was a tomb, saturated with the memory of death and failure. He dismounted at the entrance, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. The main tunnel yawned before him, a black maw held open by groaning waterlogged timbers. A single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow from deep within a beacon, drawing him toward his final confrontation. He left his horse and stepped into the darkness, his Winchester held tight, his boots squelching in the mud. He found them in the main chamber, a cavernous space where multiple tunnels converged. Silas Kane stood beside a massive, creaking support beam, a pistol held loosely at his side. Annie was there, tied to a wooden pillar, her eyes wide with fear, but tearless. She was her mother's daughter, strong even in terror. Two of Kane's men flanked him, and their rifles leveled at the entrance. "Welcome home, Jack," Silas said, his voice echoing in the cavern. He had pulled down his bandana. His face was leaner, harder than in the photograph, etched with lines of bitterness, but his eyes were the same, intense and burning with a feverish light. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way." "Let her go, Silas." Jack set his voice a low growl. He kept his rifle pointed at the floor, a precarious truce. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it has always been between you and me." Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "She is merely the audience. She deserves to know the truth about her father, about the man whose ambition put her mother in the ground." He began to pace his movements, charged with years of pent-up rage. "Do you remember that day, Jack?" The ground was soft from the thaw. "I told you. I warned you we needed to reinforce this chamber before we went any deeper. But you wouldn't listen. You saw a new silver vein, and all you could see was the glint of coin. You were reckless, impatient. You pushed the men too hard." The words were poisoned darts, each one finding its mark in the soft flesh of Jack's own guilt. He remembered the argument. He remembered ignoring the warnings. "They came to bring us lunch." Silas continued, his voice cracking with a pain that was still raw. "Mary and Elizabeth. My beautiful Elizabeth. They walked into this very chamber, and the earth gave way. Your greed brought the mountain down on their heads. I came back to find nothing. Just a pile of rock and the hollow echo of your name." "It was an accident," Jack said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "There are no accidents," Silas roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "Only choices. You chose the silver over their safety. You chose your ambition over my wife, over your own." The confrontation Jack had sought was here, but it was nothing like he'd imagined. It was not a battle of good versus evil, but a collision of two broken men, drowning in a shared sea of grief. The tension snapped. One of Kane's men shifted his weight, his rifle wavering. It was the only opening Jack needed. He brought the Winchester up and fired not at the man, but at a lantern hanging above him. The glass shattered, plunging one side of the cavern into darkness and chaos. The cavern erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes provided the only light-strobing, nightmarish images of the desperate fight. Jack dove behind a pile of rubble, firing back the explosions of his rifle and pistol deafening. One of Kane's men went down with a cry. The other scrambled for cover. Amidst the chaos, Silas surged forward, not with his gun, but with a fury born of pure hatred. He tackled Jack, and they crashed to the muddy floor, grappling for control. It was a brutal, primitive struggle. Punches landed with wet, solid thuds. They rolled through the mud and rock, two ghosts fighting in their own tomb. Jack gained the upper hand for a moment, pinning Silas against the wet rock wall. "This isn't about them anymore, Silas." He gasped, his lungs burning. "This is about you. You've become a monster." Silas spat a mouthful of blood and mud. A wild, triumphant grin spread across his face. "You still don't get it, do you? You still see yourself as the hero of this story." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them, sharp and deadly as a blade. "Let me tell you the final secret, Jack. The one Mary never had the chance to. Why was she here that day? Not just to bring you lunch. She was here to leave you. The world stopped. The gunfire, the rain, the groaning timbers, it all faded away. She was afraid Silas hissed his voice, dropping to a venomous whisper. She saw your recklessness, the same damn ambition that I'm talking about. She loved you, but she couldn't live with the man you were becoming. She and Elizabeth were going to take the children and go. She was going to tell you that day. You didn't just kill her, Jack. You drove her away first. The revelation struck Jack with more force than any physical blow. It was the final devastating twist of the knife. It reframed everything. His righteous quest shattered, leaving him exposed, his own flaws laid bare. He wasn't just a victim of Silas's revenge. He was a participant in the tragedy that had created it. The groaning of the mine timbers grew louder, a deep guttural sound from the belly of the earth. The whole structure was beginning to fail under the strain of the storm. A torrent of muddy water began to pour from a fissure in the ceiling right over the main support beam where Silas had been standing. Jack saw his chance, not for victory, but for an ending. He shoved Silas away, scrambling toward Annie. "It ends now," he yelled over the growing roar of the collapsing mine. He cut her ropes with his knife just as Silas's remaining man took aim at him. A shot rang out from the tunnel entrance, sharp and clear. The gunman crumpled. Sarah stood there, a smoking rifle in her hands, her face grim and set. Silas, seeing his last man fall, let out a final anguished roar. He charged not at Jack, but at the main support beam, grabbing a miner's pickaxe that leaned against the wall. "If I can't have my justice," he screamed, his eyes wild with madness, "then we'll all be buried in this tomb you built." He swung the pickaxe, embedding it deep into the groaning, splintering wood. The cavern shuddered violently. Rock and dirt rained down from the ceiling. Jack didn't have time to think. He scooped Annie into his arms and ran Sarah, falling in beside him. They scrambled for the entrance as the world came down behind them. Jack glanced back one last time. He saw Silas Kane standing defiant, a man consumed by his own hate, laughing, as the mountain he could never conquer finally claimed him. The massive support beam snapped, and the roof of the cavern collapsed in a deafening final roar of rock and timber. They stumbled out into the raging storm, gasping for air, covered in mud and grime. The mine entrance behind them was gone, sealed by a mountain of rock and earth. The tomb was now permanent. The cycle of vengeance was over, buried forever with the man who had perpetuated it. The past, in all its toxicity and sorrow, was finally irrevocably laid to rest. The storm broke with the dawn. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the bruised clouds, the relentless rain softened to a gentle drizzle, washing the world clean. Jack sat on a flat rock just beyond the collapsed mine, holding Annie wrapped in his coat. She had fallen into an exhausted sleep in his arms, her small body finally surrendering to the trauma of the night. He watched her breathe each small rise and fall of her chest, a reassurance that the future at least was still intact. Sarah sat beside him, the rifle resting across her lap. The silence between them was not awkward, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They were survivors of the same war, scarred by the same man. "He was right," Jack said quietly, his gaze lost in the distance. The confession was heavy as stone he had carried for years. About the mine, about me. I was arrogant. I pushed too hard. Mary, she saw it. She was right to be afraid. He finally looked at Sarah, his eyes stripped of all pride, leaving only a raw, painful honesty. "Her death is on my hands as much as his." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was steady, compassionate. "The past is a ghost, Jack. You can let it haunt you, or you can learn to live with the memory. You made a choice back there. You chose to save your daughter, not to get your revenge. That's the man you are now. That's the man Annie needs." Her words were a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. Later that morning, Sheriff Eli and a small posse arrived, having followed Sarah's directions. They surveyed the impenetrable rock slide that sealed the mine, the finality of it, needing no explanation. The legal loose ends of Silas Kane's shadow empire would be tangled and messy, but his reign of terror was over. The coiled snake had finally been decapitated. Months bled into one another, and the valley began to heal. With Kane's oppressive hold broken, a fragile hope returned to Redemption Gulch. Ranches that had been on the verge of collapse found new life. The town, once paralyzed by fear, slowly began to breathe again. Jack, Sarah, and Annie formed a new, unspoken family. They worked together side by side to rebuild Sarah's homestead from the ashes. They raised new walls, planted a new garden, and filled the quiet air with the sounds of hammers and occasionally Annie's laughter. Their bond was not forged in romance, but in something far stronger: shared truth, mutual respect, and the quiet resilience of survivors. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jack took Annie to the small windswept cemetery where Mary was buried. The locket, a symbol of a past he had clung to so desperately, was gone, buried with Silas in the mine. In its place, Jack held a small wooden bird he had carved himself. Its lines were simple, its wings poised for flight. He knelt and placed the bird on the cool granite of the headstone. It was a symbol of letting go, of releasing his grief-stricken attachment to a memory, and embracing a future of peace and creation. "I'm at peace now, Mary," he whispered to the wind. "Annie is safe. She's happy. I'm sorry. For everything." He stood up, taking Annie's hand, and walked away from the grave. Without looking back, a weight lifted from his soul. That evening, as the three of them sat on the porch of the newly built cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and rose, Sarah handed Jack a small weathered letter. "I found this in an old box of Tom's things," she said softly. "He kept it for you. I think it's from Mary. It was sent to him just before. Well, you'll see." Jack's hands trembled as he unfolded the delicate paper. The handwriting was Mary's, elegant and familiar. It was dated the day before the mine collapse. "My dearest Jack," it began. "I write this with a heavy heart. Silas's sister and I are making plans to leave for a time. I am afraid, my love. I am afraid of the fire I see in your eyes when you speak of the mine of the silver. It is a hunger that I fear will consume the wonderful man I married. I love you more than this world, but I cannot let our daughter grow up in the shadow of such a dangerous ambition. I am coming to the mine tomorrow to tell you this. I pray you will understand that you will choose us. Choose our family. Whatever your choice, know that my heart is yours now and always." Tears welled in Jack's eyes, blurring the precious words. It was not a letter of abandonment, but a plea for his return. It confirmed his recklessness, yes, but it also affirmed her unwavering love. Silas had twisted the truth into a weapon, but Mary's own words, reaching across the years, were an absolution. The last vestiges of his guilt washed away in the fading light. He looked up from the letter at Sarah's compassionate face and at his daughter Annie, who leaned sleepily against his side. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the valley in a gentle, peaceful twilight. He was a man who had walked through the deepest shadows of his past and emerged into the light, not unscathed, but whole. Before them stretched the wide open land, no longer a place of ghosts and painful memories, but a canvas on which to build a new life, a complete family founded on a bedrock of truth and forgiveness.